Hey, what's going on, guys? What's happening? YouTube. In today's video, we're going to be talking about the concept of rent strikes. This is kind of really big in the media right now with the whole Modelo cough thing going on. And it really shouldn't be surprising because there's a lot of kind of more socialist leaning talk lately. Everybody seems to hate landlords, so I suppose it makes sense. Let's just all not pay our rent. I was going to title this video, "This Rent Strike is the Dumbest Shit I've Ever Heard." But to be more YouTube friendly, we'll call it "What's the Deal with Rent Strikes" or something like that. So we got two articles. One is from the Chicago Tribune. This one's from today, March 31st. And I think this one was from yesterday. This one's from the AP. It looks like Where's Waldo fucked Stephen Colbert and their child got into a tub of bleach. And they're talking about rent strike idea gaining steam. Now, let's talk about this. Before we get into the articles, the whole point of a strike, or the definition of a strike, it typically is in regards to labor strikes, right? But it's one side's unhappy with the negotiation or one side's unhappy with the situation, whether it be the pay isn't good enough, unsafe work conditions. And what they do, the people who are going on strike or have a beef, they strike against their employer, who's the one who's the cause of the beef, and they withhold their labor in an effort to get their employer to make some concessions, be it a shorter workday, better pay, safer working conditions. What I fail to understand about this whole rent strike thing, it doesn't seem like people are upset with their landlords, aside from the fact that everybody just seems to hate landlords these days. Nobody really seems to necessarily have a beef with their landlords regarding the Modelo cough. Most people's beef seem to be with they're off work and their employer isn't paying them while they're off. The government is giving people $1,200 and expecting that to last until June for people, most of whom don't have $400 to withstand an emergency. A lot of people are upset that the government doesn't solve the healthcare crisis and provide a better healthcare system. So most people's beefs seem to be either with their employers or with the government. So why are people, quote unquote, striking against their landlords who nobody really seems to have a beef with? I get it. Everybody hates landlords. If you want to hate some mega corporation who owns tons of properties, cool. But a lot of landlords are probably your fucking grandpa who's retired and maybe has a rental property that pays part of his bills. For me personally, I provide a nice, clean, safe place to live. I charge reasonable rent. If my tenants need anything, things are fixed within 24 hours. Nobody has any right to be upset with me, nor am I some rich monocle-wearing guy who's lighting cigars with $100 bills. I don't know. I really don't get this whole thing. Let's take a look at two quick articles here. I would love to see Graham Stephan do an article about this. He's a little bit too nice. He's a little bit too well-spoken to really go off on a topic like this. But being a landlord, I'd be curious to kind of hear how he feels about this. And landlord, that's his main thing, right? So this article is St. Louis AP. With millions of people suddenly out of work and rent due at the first of the month, some tenants are vowing to go on a rent strike until the blank pandemic subsides. New York, Boston, Los Angeles, San Francisco, and St. Louis are among many cities that have temporarily banned evictions, but advocates for the strike are demanding that rent payments be waived, not delayed, for those in need during the crisis. The rent strike has taken root in parts of North America and as far away as London. And here's another funny thing about this, right? If somebody was laid off, truly doesn't have the money, I still don't agree with it, but whatever. I at least kind of see where they're coming from. People who still have jobs and are able to make rent just think because this situation's going on that they shouldn't have to pay rent. What's going to wind up happening eventually in the long run is anytime businesses face risk, they just up their charges to accommodate for that risk. So if you're paying $1,500 for rent now, landlords are going to start charging $2,000 because God forbid something happens and governments think that they can use landlords' money and landlords' property as charity to the people, and that's a risk. Or people just decide that they're not going to pay rent, and that's a risk that landlords need to build into the rent. So your $1,500 rent is now going to be $1,800 or $2,000 because landlords need to accommodate for stuff like this. Or landlords just start getting out of the business of being landlords, and there's less properties, which laws of supply and demand are going to drive the cost of rent up furthermore anyways. White sheets are being hung in windows of apartments to show solidarity with the movement that is gaining steam on Twitter, Instagram, and other social media sites. Flyers urging people to participate are being posted in several cities, including bus stops in St. Louis, where 27-year-old Kyle Kofrin still has a job at an ice cream factory, but his 3 roommates have suddenly found themselves unemployed. Their property manager so far hasn't agreed to a payment plan, Kofrin said. Now, I'm going to interrupt this again. One of the things I've been kind of pleasantly surprised by is, I'm a member of some different landlord forums. I visit some landlord subreddits. Most landlords I've seen and spoken with are actually being very accommodating. Most landlords I've seen plenty of landlords who are being extremely generous, saying, look, I don't like this, but I can afford to take the hit. I'm waiving rent this month. No government forced them to do it. They're just out of the goodness of their own heart offering free rent. Pretty much every landlord I've seen, now most states have stopped the ability to charge late fees, but even where that hasn't happened or before it happened, most landlords I've seen said, I'm not going to charge late fees. A lot of landlords are saying, I'm willing to take enough to cover my nuts. So if my property taxes, insurance, mortgage is $800 and I normally charge $1,200 for rent, I'm willing to take $800, cover my necessities. I'm not going to make anything off you this month. So I've actually seen landlords being pretty accommodating and pretty nice about this. Article goes on to say, for me personally, with everyone losing their jobs and unable to pay, it's really the only thing we can do, Coffin said of the strike. It's just like we, the people, have to do something. We can't just stand idly by while the system takes us for, the system takes us for a ride. If this starts happening, I'm just going to start walking in the grocery store, walking out with I wouldn't do that because I'm not a piece of shit. But you guys get the point. I mean, if we can just decide not to pay our rent, why can't we just walk into Best Buy and take the things we need? Why can't we just walk into the grocery store and take the things we need? Why can't I hold a doctor at gunpoint and make him provide me care for free? It just, I don't know. It's getting fucking nuts. Stay-at-home orders and strict limits on gathering sizes have forced shops, restaurants, and bars to shut down indefinitely. Many service industry workers are thrust into unemployment and living paycheck to paycheck in the best of times. Now many say they don't have money to pay the rent. Some politicians have expressed support, if not directly for a strike, then for a temporary rent moratorium, including Democratic presidential candidate Bernie Sanders. In New York, the state hit the hardest so far by the pandemic. Democratic State Senator Mike Gianaris of Queens introduced a bill that would forgive rent and mortgage payments for 90 days for people and small businesses struggling because of the coronavirus. It has 21 sponsors. Now, here's one of my biggest beefs with this thing. I have no problem with people forgiving rent if the government can, actually I still do have a problem with it, but I have less of a problem with people not paying their rent if the government provides some support for landlords, right? Mortgage forgiveness. Now, here's the thing. There's two kind of different things being discussed. One is pushing back rent and all that money will eventually still be owed. And the other is just completely forgiving that money. Well, if you completely forgive that money and rent's $1,000 a month and this goes on for 3 months, the landlord's out $3,000. Is his mortgage company going to forgive that $3,000? Maybe the government forces them to, but now we have the government essentially stealing money from banks or stealing money from private businesses. No, I don't have a ton of sympathy for the banks who've gotten bailouts and everything else, but it kind of sets a bad precedent that the government is just able to steal money from private citizens or from private companies. Tenants can't pay rent if they can't earn a living. Let's hashtag cancel rent for 90 days to keep people in their homes during the hashtag beer virus crisis, Gianaris said on Twitter. Strike advocates aren't waiting for legislative approval. Activist organizations in many places are leading the push for a strike. A group called Rent Strike 2020 is organizing on a national level. Our demands to every governor in every state are extremely simple. Freeze rent, mortgage, and utility bill collection for 2 months or face a rent strike. Rent Strikes 2020 website states. And the government would also need to forgive property taxes because that's another expense that landlords have. Advocates in St. Louis are encouraging those who can't afford rent to join a movement in solidarity, or they're encouraging people who can't afford rent to join the movement in solidarity with those who can't. Without a large number of participants, landlords will simply evict strikers, said Chris Winston of For the People STL. Others say a rent strike could further worsen the economy if landlords and property managers themselves are forced to default on loans. Some strike advocates have urged banks to suspend requiring payments from landlords and property management companies so that those groups can better absorb their own financial losses from a rent strike or moratorium. Matthew Chase, an eviction attorney in St. Louis County, said property management companies and landlords have employees to pay, utilities to pay, and other costs. A widespread rent strike could force them to lay off their own workers, cut back on property maintenance, or even close apartment complexes. Chase cited one client who relies on income from renting a couple homes. She's the big bad landlord She's the big bad landlord to these rent strike folks, Chase said. Nick Kassoff, who lives in the St. Louis suburb of Ferguson, calls himself a small-time landlord. He had words of warning for anyone refusing to pay their rent. Courts are closed, but they won't be closed forever, Kassoff wrote on Facebook. If you choose not to pay rent when you are able to, your landlord will be down there filing eviction the day they open back up. You will lose your home, ruin your credit, and make it difficult to get any sort of decent housing in the future. A rent strike isn't going to liquidate capitalism and make you a homeowner. It's going to demolish your credit and make you homeless. Here's another one out of Chicago, titled Rent is Due Wednesday. Here's what to know about rent strikes and beer cough related resources in Chicago. Let's see here. This guide was updated at 3:30 p.m. Rent is due Wednesday for thousands of Chicagoans, but as the beer cough crisis has prompted the governor to pause evictions and provide mortgage relief, renters have questions. Do we need to pay rent April 1st? Are there resources available for those who are unemployed or otherwise financially impacted by the beer cough pandemic? Here is a guide to what the government and other organizations are doing for renters and landlords and other information you need to know. Do I need to pay rent for April? As of Tuesday morning, there has been no suspension of rent payments for Chicago or the state of Illinois. This means that tenants still owe rent. During a March 19th address, Mayor Lori Lightfoot called upon property owners to give tenants some grace wherever possible during these trying times. Many large rental companies and small-scale landlords are recommending tenants contact them if they will not be able to pay rent on Wednesday. Some have suggested they will work out payment plans or other ways of making it easier on those who are out of work or otherwise financially impacted by the beer cough. Now, here's one thing about my personal situation. My rental property is actually sitting empty right now, and I think I may just let it wind up sitting empty for a while. My last tenant was a Section 8 tenant, which I wasn't necessarily a big fan of, but at least with Section 8, you're guaranteed like 90% of your money. So I may actually be trying to get a Section 8 tenant this time around. I can pretty much count on a tenant not paying me, but at least I'll get my cut from the government. And last time around, I think my rent was $1,400. Government paid $1,236 or something. The tenant paid the remainder. So if I lose out on $150, $200 from the tenant, so be it. But at least I get the majority of my money. But I've been kind of hesitant to rent anything out with everything going on right now. Housing justice advocates recommend gathering any documents that show your loss of income was due to the beer cough outbreak and contact your landlord in writing to create a paper trail. But there's nothing in place to force these relief measures, meaning rent is still due Wednesday. Can I be evicted if I don't pay? On Monday, Cook County extended its suspension of eviction cases through May 18th, along with most other court cases. That means landlords can still file for eviction, but court proceedings won't move forward until the moratorium is lifted. Evictions have also been halted at the statewide level for as long as Governor J.B. Pritzker's stay-at-home order is in place. And here's one interesting thing. At least in Illinois, I believe the governor only has the ability to go into like emergency mode for 30 days. So I know our governor had a meeting today. I'm not really sure what came of that. But I think there's only so long that they can continue locking things down and, halting rent and halting the courts. But once the order is lifted and proceedings resume, landlords will be able to move forward with eviction cases filed during the crisis, meaning tenants could be forced from their homes down the line if they don't pay rent. Now, another thing to consider is most people don't have $400 to withstand an emergency, right? So even if a landlord does decide to be nice and say, okay, I won't collect rent for 3 months, but you owe me at the end of that, what do you think are the chances are that 3 months from now they're going to be able to come up with 3 months rent altogether? I mean, really the only solution to this is the government to start spitting out some money, but it'll be interesting to see how this shakes out. What is a rent strike, and what would one look like in Chicago? A collaborative movement between tenants, typically within the same building or city. Rent strikes have taken place for hundreds of years in American history. Major rent strikes included 1907 strike organized by a 16-year-old in New York, and a 1964 Harlem rent strike organized by Jess Gravy, who went on to form the National Tenants Organization. Withholding rent en masse is meant to force landlords to take certain actions, whether it be suspending rent collection during the beer crisis, or making much-needed repairs on dilapidated buildings. But renters risk eviction and credit hits by doing so. Now, here's another thing. If your landlord is a slumlord and they're not making repairs, or you live in an unsafe place, I'm all for you striking or withholding rent or whatever else. But if your landlord provides a nice, safe place for you to live and makes repairs in a timely manner, you really have no beef against them. And I'm guessing some of these previous rent strikes have actually been justified. This one, I get where people are coming from. It doesn't really seem to be the landlords who people have a beef with. Like I said, people seem to have a beef with their employers and the government, but they want to take it out on their landlords. Withholding rent in mass is meant to... Okay, we talked about that. In Chicago, tenants of Hyde Park-based Mac properties have organized the most well-publicized rent strike in the city, but renters in Uptown's Lawrence House are also threatening to strike, saying they deserve reduced rent while the building's highly touted amenities are out of service. Now, that makes sense, right? Like, if you live in a really nice building that's got a pool and a walking trail and a gym, and all that stuff isn't there, and you're paying, theoretically a couple $100 extra to live in that building for those amenities, and you're unable to use those amenities, well, that makes sense. You get a cut on your rent. So supporters of rent strikes are calling on tenants, even those who can afford to pay rent, to not pay Wednesday as a show of solidarity. Tenants United Hyde Park Woodlawn, a group that formed 2 years ago to connect Southside renters, has gotten requests for help with rent strikes across the city, its leaders say. From Beverly to Humboldt Park, renters are desperate for relief. But what about a rent freeze? There are a few different definitions of a rent freeze, with some signifying a halt specifically on rent increases, and others seeking a postponement or total forgiveness of rent payments. The Autonomous Tenants Union, the Chicago group whose rent freeze petition has received more than 15,000 signatures, wants the city to waive rents, mortgage payments, and utility fees indefinitely. I'm not sure if that means until this is over, or just nobody ever wants to pay rent, utilities, or mortgages for the rest of their life. Freezing all three would mean landlords don't risk losing their properties to foreclosure due to missing rent payments, supporters say. But Illinois has a 23-year-old statewide ban on rent regulation, which the Chicago Department of Housing said prevents Chicago from having any control over the charging of residential rent. Illinois legislators or its governor would have to either have to lift the ban, or the new law would have to be overturned in court for the city to take action. On Monday, 14 Chicago aldermen, mostly those in the city council's Latino caucus, joined the Lift the Ban coalition and dozens of community organizers, unions, and churches to call on Pritzker to repeal the ban and establish a rent holiday and mortgage forgiveness. And will Pritzker voice support for repealing the state's 1997 Rent Control Preemption Act during a gubernatorial campaign? The advocates, like the Lift the Ban coalition, have long called for its removal. It remains intact. Here's a long read on the history of the 1997 law. No, thank you. On Tuesday, Pritzker said he does not have the power to overturn the ban with an executive order. That's not something I can control, he said, pointing to the state's moratorium on evictions and other support for residents. How would a rent freeze impact landlords? Landlords have voiced concerns about how losing out on rent money would impact both their bottom lines and their ability to pay their employees, property taxes, and utility bills for their buildings. Property owners have financial obligations and expenses, said Michael Minnie, executive vice president of the Chicagoland Apartments Association, a trade group for property owners and developers. It's unrealistic to think they would be able to provide safe, decent housing if they don't have the resources to do so. Some of Minnie refers to mom and pop landlords have small portfolios that they depend on as a way of living. Without mortgage relief, property owners could face foreclosure. Are cities or states freezing rent? Oakland, California is temporarily freezing rent until at least the end of May, but rent will still be owed after the freeze is lifted, leaving some to call for owed payments to be permanently forgiven. Again, who's going to pay for that? In New York, Governor Andrew Cuomo sought to suspend mortgage payments for single-family homes. He has only postponed rent payments, meaning they'll still be owed after the crisis has passed. But New York legislators have proposed forgiving 90 days worth of those payments completely as well as offering mortgage relief to landlords whose tenants are impacted. Late fees would also be forgiven. Specifically in New York City, Mayor Bill de Blasio said he wants to ban any increases on rent this year for the city's 1 million rent-regulated apartments, a move that would require state approval. In Massachusetts, Boston and Springfield legislators are considering similar measures. Seattle City Council also passed a non-binding resolution calling for relief. At the national level, a site Rent Strike 2020 organized by left-leaning groups such as the Socialist Alternative and Rose Caucus has created petitions calling on each state to enact a rent freeze or a rent strike. Democratic candidates Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden are also calling for a rent freeze and forgiving the back rent. Can the government really force banks to waive mortgage payments? Well, the federal government can more easily enforce moratoriums on federally backed housing loans. States and cities that put measures in place during the blank outbreak have relied on banks to cooperate. In California, Governor Gavin Newsom got 5 major banks to agree to suspend mortgage payments for 3 months. Cuomo's directive to suspend mortgage payments is not mandatory, while Boston City Council resolution would also be non-binding. Are there Chicago or Illinois resources for tenants who can't afford to pay rent? On Friday, Mayor Lori Lightfoot announced a city grant program that will give $1,000 payments to 2,000 Chicagoans who have lost their jobs or otherwise been impacted by the economic fallout from the beer cough. Chicagoans have until 11:59. Okay, so the rest is just kind of about Chicago. Let me know your guys' thoughts about this. Do you think this is fair? Do you think this is right? If this works out, what would it look like? Is it fair to for the government to not allow landlords to collect rent without also providing those landlords with that money they're missing out on? This whole beer cough thing is turning into a giant shit show. I don't really have too much more to say about any of it, so I'm just going to cut the video. But let me know your guys' thoughts. Drop a comment down below. If you're not subscribed to the channel, subscribe, and we'll catch you guys on the next video. Later.